Chapter 8. A Fatal Fall. The basement studio smelled of linseed oil and turpentine, scents that Rebecca Walsh had loved for 40 years. She stood before her easel on this Thursday evening, brush in hand, trying to capture the exact shade of amber that Lake Champlain turned during autumn sunsets. The painting was for the church fundraiser. They always sold well, those sunset pieces. People wanted hope on their walls, wanted to believe that darkness always gave way to light. Rebecca hummed Amazing Grace as she worked, the hymn as natural to her as breathing. At 68, her hands still held steady, though arthritis made her grip the brush differently now, more from the side than above. She'd adapted, learned new techniques, refused to let age steal this joy from her. The studio was her sanctuary, carved from what had once been a root cellar in this 1890s cottage. She'd installed the track lighting herself after Harold died, determined to keep painting even in her grief. It had taken 3 trips to Home Depot and 2 YouTube tutorials, but she'd done it. Harold would have been proud. The walls were lined with her work. 30 years of Lake Champlain sunsets, each one unique, each one capturing a moment when the world had seemed to hold its breath. She knew every rock formation along the shoreline, every way the light changed with the seasons. People asked why she painted the same scene over and over. They didn't understand that it was never the same scene. The lake was always different, always new, always offering another glimpse of God's artistry. 5 years without Harold. 5 years of waking to an empty bed, cooking for one, talking to God more than ever, because he was the only one who listened without pitying her. The congregation meant well with their casseroles and concerned phone calls. But Rebecca had learned to find peace in solitude. Her faith had deepened in widowhood, become something sturdy and unshakable. The painting was coming along nicely. She'd gotten the water right, that peculiar stillness that preceded twilight. Now she was working on the sky, layering oranges and pinks and that particular shade of amber that made her breath catch every time she saw it in nature. She didn't hear the back door open upstairs. Ian Martin had learned to move silently over the past weeks. He'd practiced in his own apartment, timing how long he could hold his breath, how to place his feet to avoid creaking floorboards, how to turn doorknobs without making them click. He'd studied Rebecca's routines from the driveway across the street. She painted every Tuesday and Thursday evening from 7 to 9, always with music or hymns playing, always lost in her work. He knew she kept her back door key under a ceramic frog in the garden. He knew she took sleeping pills and went to bed at 10. He knew she had no security system because God watches over this house. The cottage was smaller than his other targets' homes, but the property itself was worth a fortune. Waterfront access, 3 acres, perfectly positioned for subdivision into 4 luxury lots. Rebecca had refused his offers politely but firmly for 6 months, always with that same infuriating smile. "This is my home, Mr. Martin. Harold built the additions himself. We planted those trees for our grandchildren. I could never sell our memories." Her memories were worth about $200,000 to Ian, money he desperately needed. The gambling debts had metastasized. He was getting calls from numbers he didn't recognize, threats delivered in calm voices that scared him more than shouting would have. He had 2 weeks, maybe less, 2 weeks before something very bad happened to him, before the kind of people who didn't make idle threats decided to collect in ways that didn't involve money. He descended through the cottage like a ghost. Living room with its doily-covered furniture and photos of grandchildren. Kitchen spotless, Bible open on the table. Hallway lined with Rebecca's paintings. All sunsets, all hope, all lies about the world being beautiful. He found the basement door and opened it slowly. The stairs descended into warm light and the smell of paint. He could hear her humming, that same hymn his grandmother used to sing. For a moment, guilt flickered in his chest, but he strangled it. He'd strangled worse things. This would be clean. Simple. An old woman falls downstairs. Happens every day. No fire, no poison, no hands around a throat. Just gravity and brittle bones. Ian positioned himself at the top of the stairs and called out, "Mrs. Walsh." The humming stopped. He heard her set down her brush, heard the surprise in her voice as she looked up. "Mr. Martin, what are you doing in my home?" "We need to talk about your property." He descended 3 steps, keeping his footfalls heavy and normal, as if he had every right to be there. Rebecca appeared at the bottom of the stairs, paint-stained apron still on, confusion giving way to annoyance. This is inappropriate. You need to leave. She started up the stairs toward him, one hand on the railing, her other hand gestured emphatically. I've been patient with you, young man, but this is breaking and entering. I'm going to have to call. When she reached the midpoint of the stairs, Ian shoved her, his hands connected with her shoulders. She was lighter than he expected, more fragile. For an instant, their eyes met. Rebecca's widened in shock and betrayal, a hurt so profound it was worse than fear. Then she was falling. Time elongated like taffy. Rebecca's body tilted backward, arms windmilling, trying to catch purchase on air. Her hip struck the fifth stair down with a crack that Ian heard over her gasp. She tumbled, her body bouncing off edges and rails like a rag doll thrown by a child. Her head hit the concrete floor at the bottom with a sound like a melon splitting. Ian gripped the railing, breathing hard. The cottage was silent except for his ragged breathing and a terrible wet wheeze from below. He descended carefully, stepping over the paint supplies Rebecca had dropped. She lay in a growing pool of blood, one leg bent at an impossible angle, one arm trapped beneath her torso. Her apron was soaked red, but her eyes were open. She was still alive, still conscious, still aware. Mrs. Walsh, his voice came out strangled, barely recognizable as his own. Rebecca's eyes found him. Blood ran from her nose and mouth, but her lips moved. She was trying to speak. Ian found himself kneeling beside her, unable to look away, morbid fascination overcoming his urgency to flee. What did someone say when they were dying? Did they curse, beg, accuse? Rebecca's whisper was almost inaudible, each word formed with tremendous effort. God, forgive you. Ian recoiled as if she'd struck him, his hand jerking away from where it had been hovering near her shoulder. You don't know what you're doing. Each word cost her everything. Blood bubbled at her lips, making her words wet and broken. I'll pray. For you. Every day. In heaven. I'll pray. Don't, Ian said, his voice cracking, breaking like a teenage boy's. Don't you dare. But Rebecca's eyes had already unfocused, looking past him toward the ceiling, towards something he couldn't see. Her lips still moved, forming silent words. Prayers. Even dying, broken and bleeding on her basement floor, she was praying for him, for the man who had murdered her. Ian watched until her chest stopped moving, until the blood stopped flowing, until her eyes became glass. Dead. Finally, completely dead. He stood on shaking legs and surveyed his work. The staging needed to be perfect. He carried paint supplies up to the landing, arranged them carelessly, kicked the small rug askew, created a narrative. Rebecca carrying supplies downstairs, tripping on the rug, tumbling to her death. He'd gotten paint on his shoe. He wiped it on her apron. Let them think she'd been wearing it when she fell. Before leaving, Ian looked back once. Rebecca lay in her studio, surrounded by her paintings of hope and light, a woman of faith murdered by a man without any. Her unfinished sunset still sat on the easel, the amber sky incomplete. Ian locked the back door from the inside, left through the front, and drove home with his hands shaking on the wheel. He made it to his apartment before vomiting in the kitchen sink, but he couldn't vomit out the image of Rebecca's eyes, couldn't purge her final whispered prayers from his mind. He poured a drink, then another. He'd done what needed to be done. The property would sell. The debts would be paid. Everything would be fine. He just needed to stop seeing her broken body every time he closed his eyes. Connor found Rebecca Walsh at 8:47 a.m. on Friday morning. He'd promised to check on her after she'd mentioned feeling dizzy during her last appointment. That dizziness had been Ian's toxin beginning its work, though Connor had diagnosed it as inner ear inflammation. He knew the moment he saw her cottage from the street. The wrongness hung over the property like smoke. He'd learned to sense death. It had a smell, a weight, a particular quality of silence. The front door was unlocked. Rebecca, he called, already knowing there would be no answer. He found her in the basement studio, her body cold and stiff at the bottom of the stairs. Rigor mortis had set in. She'd been dead at least 12 hours. Connor's trained eye took in the scene. paint supplies scattered on the landing, rug askew, blood pooled beneath Rebecca's head. The staging was good, but not perfect. The paint cans were arranged too deliberately, and Rebecca would never have carried that many supplies at once. She was methodical, organised. But more than that, Connor could sense Ian's presence like a stain. The killer had stood here, in this space, ending another life. Connor pulled out his phone and dialed 911, forcing distress into his voice. "This is Dr. Connor McMasters. I found one of my patients. Rebecca Walsh, 428 Lakeview Cottage. She's fallen down her basement stairs. She's not breathing. No pulse. Please send someone immediately." He performed CPR until the paramedics arrived, knowing it was futile, but maintaining the theatre. The EMTs confirmed what he already knew. Rebecca Walsh was dead, likely had been since last night. Accidental fall, obvious trauma. The coroner's inquest took less than an hour. Elderly woman, stairs in her own home, unfortunate but not uncommon. No signs of struggle, no evidence of foul play. Rebecca's body was released to the morgue by 6 p.m. Connor planned to perform the resurrection late that night, when the hospital would be at its quietest. He went home first, waited, watched the clock. At 1:30 a.m., he drove to Millbrook Hospital. The night attendant was reading a thriller novel at his desk when Connor arrived with coffee. "Burning the midnight oil, Trevor." Trevor jumped, then relaxed, seeing Connor. "Jesus, Doc, you scared me." "Sorry, couldn't sleep. Thought I'd check on some paperwork." Connor handed him the coffee. "Brought you this. Figured you could use it." "You're a lifesaver." Trevor took a grateful sip. "Quiet night, thank God. Just that old lady from the fall. Rebecca Walsh. She was my patient." Connor shook his head sadly. "Terrible thing." "Yeah, at least it was quick." Trevor yawned. "I'm going to take a quick break. Grab some air. You mind watching the desk for 5 minutes?" "Take your time." Trevor left through the side door, coffee in hand. Connor waited 30 seconds, then moved swiftly to the cold storage units. Rebecca lay on a steel gurney, sheet pulled up to her shoulders. Her face was peaceful, despite the violence of her death. Connor placed his hands on her forehead and began the incantation. The old Irish words flowing like water he'd memorized before English existed. The green light bloomed between his palms, cold and hungry. It spread through Rebecca's body, illuminating broken bones and ruptured organs. Connor felt the resistance. Death always fought back, but he was stronger. He'd always been stronger. Rebecca's chest convulsed. Once. Twice. Then she gasped, her eyes flying open wide, pupils dilating in the green light that still clung to her skin like foxfire. Connor expected confusion, expected fear, expected the usual disorientation that came with resurrection. Instead, Rebecca looked at him with an expression of transcendent joy, of absolute certainty, of someone who had seen the face of God and lived to testify. "I saw him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dried blood still on her cheeks. "I was with God, Connor. I stood in his presence. I saw heaven. It was more beautiful than any sunset I ever painted, more beautiful than anything I could have imagined. And he spoke to me. He told me it wasn't my time, that I had work to do on earth, that you would be his instrument to return me." Connor's heart sank like a stone dropped in dark water. "Rebecca, I need to explain what actually—" "No." She gripped his hands with surprising strength for someone who had been dead for 14 hours. Her fingers were warm now, alive, pulsing with renewed blood. "I understand. God works through instruments. Moses had his staff, David had his sling, the prophets had their visions. And you have this gift. You're his tool, his miracle worker." Her face glowed with certainty, with faith so absolute it was almost painful to witness. "He brought me back for a purpose. He showed me that death is not the end, that his love conquers even the grave." "It's not divine intervention," Connor said carefully. "It's necromancy, ancient practice, older than Christianity. I brought you back through God's power flowing through you." Rebecca sat up, seemingly unaware that she'd been dead for 14 hours, that her body had been broken and cold. "I saw heaven, Connor. I stood in God's presence. And he told me it wasn't my time, that I had work to do, that you would be his instrument to return me. Connor rubbed his temples. Of all his resurrections, he'd never encountered this particular complication. Eleanor had been frightened but pragmatic. Thomas had been angry. Margaret had been grateful. David had treated it like a dark joke. But Rebecca had taken a supernatural event and wrapped it in her faith so tightly that no amount of logic would unwrap it. "We need to get you somewhere safe," he said, changing tactics. "The man who killed you, Ian Martin." Rebecca's expression hardened. "I remember. He pushed me. I prayed for him as I died. He's dangerous. He can't know you're alive." "Then we'll pray for guidance." Rebecca smiled serenely. "God will show us the path." Connor, who hadn't prayed since 1625, found himself completely out of his depth. He smuggled Rebecca out of the morgue in a wheelchair covered with a sheet, wheeled her to his car like he was transporting a corpse for transfer. Trevor never noticed. He was back at his desk, nose deep in his thriller. At the farmhouse, Rebecca's arrival created immediate complications. She emerged from Connor's car with her arms spread wide, taking in the night sky. "He gave me back the stars." Eleanor came to the door, wrapped in a cardigan. She took one look at Rebecca's beatific expression and sighed. She thinks it's divine intervention, doesn't she? "God brought me back," Rebecca announced, climbing the porch steps without any sign of the injuries that had killed her. "He has a plan for me." Thomas appeared behind Eleanor, whiskey glass in hand. "Oh, fantastic. A religious zealot. Just what this resurrection party needed." "Don't be cruel," Margaret said, elbowing past him. She approached Rebecca with open arms. "Welcome back to life, however it happened." Rebecca embraced her. "God bless you, dear. We're all miracles here." "Some of us are more miraculous than others," David called from the living room. "I'm still voting for zombie apocalypse." Connor herded everyone inside before neighbours could see the gathering. In the living room, Rebecca surveyed the other resurrected patients with wonder. "Look at us, God's chosen vessels. We're here for a reason. The reason is that Connor has a guilt complex and necromancy powers." Thomas said dryly. "Not exactly divine providence." "God works in mysterious ways." Rebecca's faith was unshakable. "He gave Connor these abilities for a purpose, and that purpose is justice." "Actually," Connor interjected, "the purpose is to keep you all alive and hidden until we can deal with Ian." "Then let's deal with him." Rebecca's gentle demeanour hardened. "Let me go to him. Let me witness to him about God's mercy. If he sees what happened to me, if he understands that his sins can be forgiven." "Absolutely not." Connor's voice was firm. "That's exactly what we can't do. If Ian sees you alive, he'll panic. People will die." "We're already dead," David pointed out. "Technically. And we'd like to stay undead," Eleanor added. "Rebecca, I understand your faith. I truly do. But Connor's right. We can't confront Ian yet." Rebecca settled into an armchair, her expression serene but determined. "Then we'll pray for guidance. We'll wait for God to show us the path." Connor exchanged glances with Eleanor. They were thinking the same thing. Rebecca Walsh had come back with a mission, fueled by faith that made her fearless. And fearless people were dangerous. "For now," Connor said carefully, "we focus on gathering evidence, on building a case that will stand up in court." "God's justice is higher than man's courts," Rebecca said, "but man's courts are what we have to work with." Margaret sat beside Rebecca, taking her hand. "Please, trust us. Trust Connor." Rebecca looked around the room at the other resurrected patients, these people who had all died and come back, who had all been given a second chance. Finally, she nodded. "I'll wait. I'll pray. But God didn't bring me back to hide forever." After everyone had gone to bed, Connor stood on the porch, staring at stars he'd watched for 400 years. Eleanor joined him, bringing 2 glasses of whiskey. "She's going to be a problem," Eleanor said. "I know. Religious fervour and resurrection are a dangerous combination." "I knew that too. What are you going to do about it?" Connor took a long drink. "Pray, I suppose." Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You? Pray?" Stranger things have happened. Connor smiled grimly. I mean, we're babysitting 5 people who've come back from the dead. At this point, who knows? Maybe God is paying attention after all. Inside, Rebecca knelt beside her borrowed bed, praying for Ian Martin's soul. She prayed with the certainty of someone who had seen heaven and come back. She prayed with the passion of someone who believed miracles were not only possible, but mandatory. She prayed for justice, for mercy, and for the moment when God would tell her it was time to act. Connor, listening from the hallway, felt a chill run down his spine. He'd faced down wars, plagues, revolutions, and centuries of darkness. But Rebecca Walsh's faith might be the most dangerous force he'd yet encountered, because faith didn't listen to reason. And faith, when backed by resurrection, became something terrifying and unstoppable. Jennifer Wu sat in her Prius outside Connor's farmhouse at 10:37 p.m. on Friday night, feeling like a stalker and hating herself for it. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, even though the engine was off, knuckles white in the darkness. 2 weeks had passed since Connor had promised to introduce her to the resurrected patients. 2 weeks of excuses that grew increasingly thin. They're not ready yet. Timing isn't right. Let me prepare them first. Maybe next week would be better. She'd tried to be patient. She'd tried to trust him, to believe that Connor had good reasons for the delays. But Jennifer's entire life had been built on verifying information, on not taking things on faith, on the scientific method that demanded evidence and reproducible results. Trust, but verify. That was medicine. That was science. And trust me, I'll show you later, was neither. So here she was, parked 3 houses down with her lights off, watching Connor's farmhouse like some obsessed ex-girlfriend or private detective. Lights glowed in the windows, multiple rooms, suggesting multiple people. She could see shadows moving inside, figures crossing in front of curtains. The resurrected patients, presumably. The people Connor claimed to have brought back from death, the people he kept hidden from her. Jennifer checked her phone. 10:45 p.m. She'd give it another hour, then go home and admit defeat. Admit that maybe she didn't have the courage to. Connor emerged from the house. It was 1:30 a.m. Jennifer had dozed off briefly in her seat, jerking awake when she saw movement. Connor walked to his car, with purpose, no hesitation. He pulled out of his driveway and headed toward town. Jennifer waited 30 seconds, then followed. She'd never tailed anyone before. She stayed farther back than movie spies did, terrified he'd recognize her Prius in his rearview mirror. But Connor seemed lost in thought, taking turns without checking behind him. He was heading toward Millbrook Hospital. Jennifer's stomach clenched. It was almost 2 a.m. Connor wasn't on call tonight. She'd checked the schedule. So why was he going to the hospital in the middle of the night? Connor parked in the staff lot and entered through the emergency entrance. Jennifer gave him a 5-minute head start, then used her own credentials to follow. The hallways were eerily quiet, just the hum of machines and distant beeping. She caught sight of Connor's back, turning a corner toward the administrative wing. She followed, her footsteps silent on linoleum. He was heading toward the morgue. The morgue? Jennifer's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself into an alcove as Connor approached the morgue entrance. Through the small window in the door, she saw him speak briefly with Trevor, the night attendant. Connor handed him something, coffee, and they chatted for a moment. Then Trevor left through the side exit, leaving Connor alone. Jennifer crept closer to the morgue door, keeping to the shadows. Through the window, she watched Connor wait 30 seconds, then move swiftly to the cold storage units. He pulled out a gurney. Jennifer recognized the body, Rebecca Walsh, the kind elderly woman who painted sunsets and hummed hymns during examinations. Rebecca had died yesterday in a fall down her basement stairs. Jennifer had processed the death certificate herself. Connor positioned himself at Rebecca's head and placed both hands on her forehead. His lips moved, speaking words Jennifer couldn't hear through the door. Then his hands began to glow. Green light, cold, unnatural, wrong, emanated from Connor's palms. It spread through his fingers like phosphorescent algae, illuminating Rebecca's dead face in sickly luminescence. The light grew brighter, pulsing with the rhythm of his incantation. Jennifer's hand went to her mouth, stifling a gasp. This wasn't happening. This couldn't be happening. Green light didn't come from human hands. Dead bodies didn't. Rebecca's body convulsed. Her back arched off the gurney. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp. Her chest heaved. Once, twice, then began rising and falling in steady rhythm. She was breathing. Connor helped Rebecca sit up, moving gently, speaking to her softly. He wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Rebecca was crying, but they looked like tears of joy. She was hugging Connor, her face radiant with an expression Jennifer couldn't quite identify. Rapture? Ecstasy? Rebecca Walsh was alive. Rebecca Walsh, who had been cold and dead for 2 days, was sitting up, breathing, talking, crying tears of joy. Jennifer stumbled backward, her rational mind shattering like glass. Every assumption she'd built her life on, about science, about reality, about what was possible, crumbled into dust. Connor was a necromancer. Truly, literally a necromancer who could reverse death itself. Jennifer fled. She ran through the hospital corridors, burst through the emergency exit, sprinted to her car. She sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes, hands shaking too hard to put the key in the ignition. What she'd seen was impossible. Bodies didn't resurrect. Green light didn't emanate from human tissue. Death was permanent, final, irreversible. That was biology, physics, the fundamental truth of existence. Except she just watched Conor McMasters prove that truth was a lie. Eleanor Henderson, Thomas Grayson, Margaret Chin, David Ortiz, and now Rebecca Walsh. 5 people who had died. 5 people Connor had brought back. Jennifer finally managed to start her car. She drove home on autopilot, her mind replaying the green light, the convulsing body, the moment death reversed itself. She should be terrified. She should be calling the police, the CDC, someone. This was beyond medicine, beyond science, beyond everything she understood. Instead, she felt exhilarated. She'd witnessed the impossible. She'd seen past the veil that separated life and death and found something miraculous and terrible on the other side. Jennifer reached her apartment at 3:30 a.m. Saturday morning and sat at her kitchen table, staring at nothing. Somewhere in Millbrook, Ian Martin was murdering people. And somewhere else, Conor McMasters was bringing them back. Death and resurrection. Locked in an ancient dance that predated hospitals and medical degrees and everything Jennifer thought she knew. She eventually crawled into bed as dawn broke, but sleep wouldn't come. Her mind kept replaying the green light, the convulsing body, the impossible resurrection. Her phone buzzed at 9 a.m. A text from Connor. Are you ready to meet them today? 10 a.m. at the farmhouse? Jennifer stared at the message. He didn't know she'd followed him. Didn't know she'd already witnessed his power. She typed back, yes, I'm ready. She was ready. Because she'd already seen the truth, and there was no unknowing it. No going back to the comfortable lie of death's permanence. Jennifer Wu had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had glowed green and brought the dead back to life. Now she needed to understand it. Ian Martin's apartment looked like a crime scene. Empty scotch bottles lined the coffee table like soldiers at attention. 12 of them, maybe 15. He'd lost count. Takeout containers, bread mold in the kitchen sink, on the counters, stacked in corners. The smell was overwhelming. Rotting Chinese food, stale alcohol, his own unwashed body. Clothes lay where he'd dropped them 3 days ago when he'd stopped bothering to shower, stopped bothering to do anything except drink and search and try to understand what was happening to him. He sat at his laptop at 3:17 a.m., his eyes bloodshot and wild, dry from staring at the screen for hours without blinking. His fingers shook as he typed search queries, hitting wrong keys, having to backspace and try again. Can someone survive strangulation? How long? Fire death? Survival rate? What percentage? What temperature? Are zombies real scientific evidence proof? Necromancy. Possible modern-day real cases. People who came back from dead, documented, verified. Resurrection? Real stories, proof. The search history read like a descent into madness, like a trail of breadcrumbs leading deeper into a dark forest from which there was no return. Which was accurate because Ian was definitely, absolutely losing his mind. He could feel it happening, could feel his grip on reality loosening like a rope fraying thread by thread. 5 murders. Victims who should be dead, who he'd personally killed with his own hands. Checked for pulses that weren't there. watched stop breathing. And yet, Eleanor Henderson had drowned in her bathtub. He had killed her. It was confirmed through the media. But Ian had seen someone who looked exactly like her at the grocery store last Tuesday afternoon. Same height, same grey hair, pulled back in that same careful bun. Same way of examining produce, picking up each apple and inspecting it before placing it gently in her basket. When he'd gotten closer, heart pounding, hands shaking, she'd looked up and seen him. Their eyes had met for one frozen second. Then she'd abandoned her cart and vanished into the parking lot before he could confirm it was her, before he could grab her, before he could demand to know how she was alive. Thomas Grayson's obituary had been published in the Millbrook Gazette. Ian had the clipping saved on his phone, had read it so many times he'd memorised it. Thomas Grayson, 75, passed away peacefully at home, devoted husband to the late Patricia. But Thomas's car, that distinctive vintage Mercedes 280 SL, the one Thomas had restored himself, the one Thomas had loved more than his own children, was still parked at his house. Ian had driven by 3 times in the past week. The car was there, sometimes in different spots in the driveway, sometimes with the cover on, sometimes not. Someone was driving it. Someone was living in that house. Margaret Chen had recovered from lethal poisoning, miraculously recovered. The nurses talked about it in hushed, awed tones when they thought no one was listening. How she'd been coding, had flatlined for nearly 2 minutes, and then suddenly stabilised. Her vitals had normalised within hours. Modern medicine is amazing, they whispered. But Ian had mixed that poison himself in his apartment, had calculated the dosage using his college chemistry textbook, had tested it on the stray cat in his building to make sure it worked. That cat had died in under 3 minutes. Margaret should have died too. David fucking Ortiz had walked into one of Ian's open houses 2 weeks after Ian had watched him burn to death. David had smiled at him, made small talk about property values, acted like he hadn't died screaming in his own restaurant. And now, Rebecca Walsh. Ian had felt her neck break when she hit the stairs. He'd watched her die, had seen the light leave her eyes. Yet the hospital reported she'd been found alive with minor injuries. Minor injuries from a fall that should have killed her. It was impossible. All of it was impossible. Unless... Ian opened a new tab and typed, Millbrook, Vermont, Dr. Connor McMasters. Connor's professional website loaded. His photo smiled out at Ian, calm, confident, knowing. Those eyes seemed to look right through the screen, right into Ian's fractured mind. Connor was everywhere. That was the pattern Ian couldn't ignore. Connor had been jogging past Ian's office last Thursday, sitting 3 tables away at the bistro where Ian had lunch, at the hospital when Margaret recovered, coming out of David's restaurant, in the grocery store parking lot where Ian thought he'd seen Eleanor. Always there, always watching, always smiling that infuriating smile. Ian pulled up more photos from the town website. Connor at the clinic dedication 5 years ago. Connor volunteering at the food bank. Connor receiving some community service award. In every photo, Connor looked exactly the same. Not older, not younger, just unchanged. Ian zoomed in on Connor's face in the clinic dedication photo from 2020. Then he pulled up a photo from last month's Chamber of Commerce meeting. He placed them side by side. Identical. Not similar, identical. Same hairline, same laugh lines, or lack thereof. Same everything. 5 years, and Connor hadn't aged a day. Ian's hands shook as he poured another drink. His 6th? 7th? He'd lost count somewhere around 2 a.m. when the numbers stopped meaning anything. The scotch burned going down, but he barely felt it anymore. His throat was raw, his stomach a churning mess of acid and alcohol. But the drinking was the only thing keeping the screaming panic at bay. The search queries got worse, more desperate, more unhinged. Immortality, real proof. People who don't age vampire necromancy in Vermont, New England. Doctor who raises the dead. Ian knew he sounded insane. He knew that if anyone saw his search history, saw his apartment, saw him now, unwashed, drunk, typing questions about necromancy at 3 a.m., they'd think he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe this was what a breakdown looked like from the inside. Maybe he was in the middle of a psychotic episode and none of this was real. Not the murders, not the resurrections, none of it. But the alternative. that he'd somehow failed to murder 5 different people despite checking pulses, despite fire and poison and violence, despite personally watching them die, was more unbelievable than the supernatural explanation forming in his mind like a tumour, dark and growing. What if Connor was doing something impossible? What if death wasn't permanent for Connor's patients? What if Ian was playing a game with rules he couldn't see, against an opponent he didn't understand, in a reality that operated by different laws than the one he'd grown up believing in? Ian drank directly from the bottle now, the glass abandoned hours ago. His business had collapsed completely. He'd stopped returning client calls 2 weeks ago, stopped checking emails, stopped showing up to appointments. His voicemail was full of angry messages, confused messages, concerned messages. Creditors were calling constantly. He'd stopped answering those too. His phone buzzed and buzzed against the laptop, vibrating with threats he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge. The gambling debts had grown interest, metastasized into something lethal and immediate. The calls from unknown numbers had become texts with photos. Photos of his apartment building. Photos of his car. Photos that said, "We know where you are," without needing words. He had days now, maybe hours. The kind of people he owed money to didn't send collection notices. They sent warnings. And then they sent something much worse. He needed another score. Needed money, desperately. Needed it like oxygen, like water, like all the things that kept a body alive. But every time he considered a new target, he saw Rebecca's broken body at the bottom of the stairs. Eleanor's shocked face in the grocery store. David's knowing smile as he'd walked through that open house like a ghost made flesh. His victims were haunting him, not as ghosts. Ghosts he could dismiss as guilt and alcohol. They were haunting him by being alive. Ian pulled up Connor's photo again and stared into those calm eyes. In the pixelated image, he thought he saw something ancient looking back. Knowledge that predated medical degrees and modern medicine. Something old and powerful and amused. "What are you?" Ian whispered to the screen. The question hung in the air of his destroyed apartment, unanswered. Ian knew, on some level, that he was losing this game. That he'd been losing since the moment he strangled Thomas Grayson, and Connor McMasters had somehow brought him back. He was playing chess against someone who could resurrect pawns, who could reverse checkmate, who could rewrite the rules of life and death itself. And the worst part, the part that kept Ian drinking at 3 a.m., typing insane search queries, jumping at shadows, was that he couldn't stop. He was in too deep. His debts were too large, his desperation too complete. He needed money, needed it like oxygen, and the only way he knew to get it was through murder and real estate. But how do you kill someone when death isn't permanent? How do you fight a doctor who can resurrect the dead? Ian finished the bottle and passed out at his laptop, his screen still showing Connor's smiling professional photo. His last conscious thought was a prayer to a God he didn't believe in. Please let this be paranoia. Please let me be going insane. Because the alternative was so much worse. In his dreams, Connor's smile grew wider and wider until it split his face, revealing something ancient and terrible behind the human mask. Connor laughed, and the laugh echoed through centuries, through epidemics and wars, and the long darkness of human history. When Ian woke at dawn, face pressed against his keyboard, the dream's terror clung to him like a second skin. The certainty that he was being hunted by something he didn't understand, couldn't fight, couldn't escape. It had become more real than the walls of his apartment. He was prey now. And Connor McMasters, ageless, knowing, impossibly powerful, was the predator. Ian stumbled to the bathroom and stared at his reflection. The man looking back was gaunt, wild-eyed, unshaven. A man coming apart at the seams. A man who had committed 5 murders and watched every victim return from the grave. This isn't happening, Ian told his reflection. But it was happening. And deep in his alcohol-soaked, panic-stricken mind, Ian understood that there was only one way this ended. He just hoped it would be quick.